My chance new girl watch made in China. We play ping pong ball made in China.
Hello and welcome to China Econ Talk. I'm Jordan Schneider, your host here today with Tianjie, founder and host of Chublicopinion.com. That's CHUBLIC opinion.com, a blog covering Chinese online public opinion. Tianjie, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, your blog is really remarkable in its analysis and long history of these monthly reports. I'm curious what first brought you to start this project.
I think the blog was started because I was inspired by a Chinese blog which no longer exists. It's actually a column which used to be hosted on the Financial Times Chinese website called Tianjie, which was written by a veteran editor at the Shanghai Oriental Daily at around that time, and he did a fantastic job of sort of summarizing and digesting what's going on in the Chinese media landscape on numerous issues and shedding a light on the kind of public mood and the zeitgeist of the time. But he stopped his blog in 2014. So
was there one column that you remember in particular as being really, really interesting?
Well, there are many of them especially in those quite defining moments in recent history, like the Tianjie. The high-speed rail crash in Wenzhou in 2011, which was a mega event on Chinese social media around that time. And he did a really good job summarizing what's the different schools of thought and debates around that big event. And it was definitely an inspiring thing around that time. And I was a big fan of that blog. Unfortunately, it was in English, in Chinese only. And I think that the international audience would definitely benefit from something like that. So around 2015, I started this Chublicopinion, largely taking the approach similar to that Tianjie column, but doing it in English. Unfortunately, he stopped blogging in 2014, so mine's sort of become the thing that's left behind, and but I have been doing it for the past 3 years.
So two questions. First, have you reached out to him yet?
Yes. We're on WeChat. And
so
he's
fun.
doing a business now. I think he's not in the business of writing anymore. But I did reach out to him and told him that I was inspired by his blog. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. So question number two. So was this following the tides of current opinion, something you've been interested for a long time? Was it related at all to what you studied in school, or just started as a hobby?
Yeah, I have been doing this for quite a while because my previous job was in advocacy in the environmental field. So to be effective in advocacy, actually, you need to have a sense of where the public mood is and where public opinion lies on certain topics and issues. For example, one of the issues I've been following quite closely was pollution, right? So how public reacts to pollution. And that would definitely affect how we design advocacy projects and how you define design your messages so that it got more resonance with the public. So I think with this is how I sort of trained myself in sort of reading public mood through Chinese media and also social media.
That's really interesting because one of the striking features of your blog is how it's straight news. There isn't a lot of advocacy or talking one side or another. There is that kind of writing difficult for you coming from that sort of background, or did it end up becoming more and more natural, the straight reporting aspect of your blog?
Well, I think it's a conscious choice, right? So definitely, I think I need to separate when I was writing the blog. I need to separate it clearly from my job, right? And I do feel that for a blog like this, being impartial is very important.
Sure.
Because you do want to represent the different views on Chinese social media. Even some of them, I strongly disagree, right? There are a lot of very nationalistic voices that I don't like, but I feel that it's my responsibility to represent them because they also represent a very important part of online opinion in China. So I definitely need to be disciplined in writing the blog.
One sec. Though it does seem like you seem to have a bit of fun when you get to quote these very strong statements from these very right wing nationalists. It seems like you also enjoy
Yes.
reading that sort of stuff and getting into the weeds on the far right perspective.
Yeah, because I think some of them are funny, right? Because they tend to use very flowery languages, which make it fun to translate and try to express in English.
For sure.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting experience.
So speaking of about English, your writing is really incredible, and frankly, I'm jealous and wish I could write. I wish I could write that way. So I'm curious if you have any advice to language learners of Chinese or English out there. What do you think you've done that's been so helpful in getting your written level up so high?
Well, I think reading definitely helps a lot. I think I'm a pretty heavy reader, so whenever I'm like walking or running, I like to listen to very well narrated English materials, and I do keep vocabularies quite systematically using different apps and things like that.
Like which?
A Biscuit.
Biscuit.
Yeah, there's this very small app called Biscuit that helps you organize vocabularies. Whenever you pick up something online or reading, you can just organize it into different vocabularies. So
Cool.
This is something I do. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the book you're listening to right now?
Well, I'm now subscribed to this app called Autumn, which it sort of collected all the articles from New Yorker, New York Review of Books, London Review of Books, and have very good narrators just read it to you, which I find very helpful when you have a lot of time, like in commute or something like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
What's frustrating for me is I can only listen to nursery stories and understand them. So hopefully when I get to be able to understand, decent journalism, I know that stuff's out there for me in Chinese. But
I think, there should be a lot of Chinese podcasts like
Himalaya.
Yeah, that can help you get familiarized with the Chinese language.
Yeah, and just a hello to all our Himalaya listeners out there. This podcast is also up on that site.
Oh, okay.
So so turning to your blog. So how do you decide what you're gonna write about every day? It's just what you find yourself reading about, or what drives you to a certain topic?
Sure. I do have a sort of a radar on my Weibo. That's how I select my topics. So first of all, I'm very selective of who I follow on Weibo. I see my Weibo follow those who I follow as samples that needs to represent a certain segment of online opinion. So whenever I see someone who is becoming increasingly relevant, who is being retweeted by some of the other people I'm following, I pay attention to them and I check their track records on Weibo and see if their opinions are original and interesting. So I do.
Is that an issue on Weibo, originality? People
Yes, because there are a lot of people who are just repeating each other, right? Then you only need to follow the one who's actually the original one,
sure.
Right? But from time to time, some of them get silented, some of them got emerged, some of them suddenly become popular, right? So I do keep update my Weibo follow list quite regularly, and I also want them to represent a certain segment. So I do, for example, have a segment that are all of the nationalists, right, from different schools, and there's a big cluster which is the finance and business commentators. There's a big cluster who are technological commentators, even anime and like game communities, right? So I want my sample to somehow reflect the zeitgeist of Weibo.
So is this something that I imagine this is something that frustrates you with a lot of Western media talks about kind of China as a monolith. and maybe parts, aspects of the society maybe, but, I think your blog is great evidence to the fact, that there is a really, a ton of diversity of opinion, with regards to basically any topic you could possibly think of. So I'm curious, if there's some Western media gets it right, if you share this frustration, what besides, reading lots of Weibo do you think, foreign journalists could do to get a better sense of these nuances that you cover?
Well, I won't say I'm frustrated because through my work, actually, I get to know a lot of the foreign correspondents based in China. Mm-hmm. Some of them are my very good friends, right? So I know what kind of constraints they need to face when they are writing their stories for their own media organizations. And some of them are not necessarily biased, but they are sort of restrained by who they can interview and what kind of sources they have access to, right? Mm. And I think social media definitely, I think many of them are becoming aware of those constraints and starting to pay more attention on this kind of social media voices and try to also develop their own samples to some extent. But to be able to decipher this kind of social media message, you do need to have a quite good grasp of, first of all, the language and then the cultural context, right? To be able to identify those that are really relevant and those that are not, because there are also a lot of noises, right, on social media.
So since this is nominally a podcast about economics, if you could throw out, 2 or 3 Weibo personalities who you think are, give us a broad range of opinions and are particularly interesting to read and follow.
Sure, like on finance and business and sort of economic issues, I would definitely recommend first of all Cao Shanshi, right? I think he is actually either a People's Daily journalist or a Xinhua news agency journalist, but he has a sort of a very different persona, right, on Weibo, and he's known for actually leaking stuff on Weibo, all kinds of internal documents, and people in those very big financial firms sometimes will send him personal messages, right, and tell me, okay, there's this thing going on in our company right now, and he posts those snapshots or screenshots, right, and becomes sort of a trending topic on Weibo.
Sure.
So he is very much, I think, widely watched on Weibo on all those kind of financial developments. Another guy I follow, which I find very original, is this guy called Yu Xiaoyang, who is actually, I think, a scholar at Tsinghua University. I think his specialty is actually in energy and environmental economics, but on Weibo, he actually gives comments to a lot of social issues from an economic point of view.
Sure.
I think he's trained at Stanford or somewhere like that. Very original, so doesn't follow any ideological rule book, right? Very original thinker. And there are a bunch of former columnists like Fu Zhifeng, who used to be a Wall Street Journal columnist for on the China side, right? Has his own Weibo and pretty influential, and a bunch of Shanghai-based analysts who are also very active on Weibo, like Fan Tong Dai Laoban. These people watch the stock market quite closely, but they also tend to comment on all kinds of social issues and things like that, and have their own financial kind of take on those things.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll put up a China Econ Talk recommends Weibo channel.
Sure, you should.
Sponsored by Chublicopinion. We'll give you all the credit, not to worry. So the reason I wanted to do this podcast now was to go a little bit deeper into your most recent post, which is about the Chinese social media response to our Maoijian, our trade war, which is happening right now. So maybe if you could start out with what the official line has been over the past few months or so, and then go on to the social responses for it. So first, what has the government been saying?
Sure, I think the government. My take is that they're still cautious, right? One of the most significant thing to understand is that the trade war hasn't started yet officially, right? Because all the tariffs that Trump has proposed hasn't actually come into effect yet. And more significantly, for the last round of Trump's bluff, right, to put extra tariff on, I think, 100 billion Chinese goods and services, China actually haven't matches his bluff yet, right? So China didn't offer any countermeasure to the latest round of Trump's threat. which I think shows, like, officially China is still pretty cautious in its response to the trade war. And if you look at all the messages from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Commerce, the message is definitely something like the trade war won't benefit anyone, right? So it seems that their desire is to end this in some way and don't actually escalate into a sort of a full-blown trade war.
Sure. I mean, it's still a very different time we're living in, from Melania coming and hanging out with pandas and Trump getting the imperial treatment at the Forbidden City. Our most recent trip of the I think they called themselves the Avengers.
The Avengers.
Well, this was in like a commonly followed newsletter about American politics. Some source from the White House said, we're sending our team of Avengers, like the Marvel movie that's coming out. And then the journalist said, well, if they're calling themselves the Avengers, it's probably not the best way to, start a negotiation, right? If you're out to fight evil. But yeah, no, we've certainly come a long way from those halcyon days. I don't know if halcyon's made it onto your biscuit list yet. So while the government's official messaging has been very muted on this topic, the social media response has certainly not been. So why don't we start with this idea of an agricultural economy versus an industrial power? You said there was a pretty interesting response to the first back and forth of the various tariff lists, where Trump said we're going to put $50 billion of tariffs on, and China coming back with their own $50 billion list. They contained very different. They were putting tariffs on very different things. So how did Weibo see these two documents?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting contrast when the U.S. actually put tariffs on some of the most advanced technologies and like industries from China, but actually what China can do with U.S. imports are mostly like in the agriculture sector. So they put extra tariff on nuts, right? Apples or grains, right?
I mean, I really like my almonds. I'm worried about this.
Yeah. So I think there was this social media response, a pretty gleeful response that is somehow is showing the shift of positions of the Chinese economy and the U.S. economy based on those two lists. Some people were saying that, okay, does this mean that China is already becoming sort of an industrial powerhouse, while it looks like the U.S. economy is dominated by the sort of agricultural sector, even though these are not actually accurate reflection of the two economies, because these are mostly like import and export, right, which doesn't necessarily reflect the whole economy. But still, I think it reflects somehow this public sentiment here that is pretty complacent, I would say, about Chinese developments in the past decades, and somehow being proud, or there's some kind of a pride in seeing that China is taking up more and more those kind of advanced technologies and being more, or even like make the U.S. feel threatened by its industries, basically.
Yeah, it's interesting because a sort of theme running through your column about this is this mix between pride and insecurity. Because on the one hand, it's we can go toe to toe with the Americans, but on the other hand, as we're going to get to in a little bit, the potential vulnerability of the Chinese economy, and how there's still a lot of aspects of it which are very much dependent on U.S. exports, which could be which Trump is looking to curtail or threaten.
Yeah.
So going to the next point, one of the interesting comparisons which social media was making was China 25 to ziji zizu, the Maoist era self-reliance, autarky type of industrial policy. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. First of all, I think Made in China 2025 is a very important policy document. I think everybody should pay attention to, because it definitely represents China's aspiration as an economy, basically, like what it would like to see itself develop into in the next 10 years, basically. And I also, I think, explains a lot of the so-called insecurity that people are feeling, because I think nowadays what dominates sort of the national discussion on economic issues is those multiple traps that people feel that's ahead of us, right? One of the traps is the so-called mid-income trap, which China definitely wants to avoid. Basically, it's seeing that at some point of your income level, right, you either get a breakthrough and upgrade your industries to a different level, or you get stuck at that level and even get a downgrade, right? And the example they use is often Latin America, right? Argentina, Brazil, which had their chance of breaking through the mid-income trap, but they somehow failed, and now they're even going back to primary industry, like going back to natural resources and agriculture, right? And they're seeing their income level like stagnate for decades. Another trap is the Japanese trap, right? Because the so-called lost decade, where it seems that Japan also somehow failed to break through, right, to another level. So I think people, policymakers, economists, the general public, that they seem to be vexing about how to overcome the so-called mid-income trap and bring the country's economy to a whole different level. And the answer is Made in China 2025, right? They are looking at Germany's plan, the so-called Made in Germany 4.0 or something like that, and they're looking at other countries, South Korea, and try to figure out, okay, how do we transfer or transform China from a country that mainly makes socks and T-shirts to an economy that can make airplanes or high-speed trains, right? All those highly like value-added industry, and I think that's sort of the core of what's being threatened now by the trade war, and why are people so worried at this point?
Sure. I mean, Trump has very explicitly said that he and a lot of other American politicians and commentators have seen Made in China 2025 as a threat, and this vision of self-reliant, not particularly, technology companies that are not particularly integrated with, global markets or using American technology is something that scares a lot of foreigners. So I'm interested, coming to that, the nationalist take on this, on this trade war. If you could walk us through, there was a great, quote by one of your sources saying that, what the trade war is trying to do is, quote, keep China in the bondage of low-end industries to be eternally exploited by the U.S. hegemony, technologically and financially. So where is this sentiment coming from, and who's echoing these sorts of thoughts?
Sure, I think those comments are coming from a kind of mental image of China being like forever a sort of a sweatshop, right? So people have this idea that in the past, the Chinese economy, and in the past 2-3 decades, right, a lot of the growth comes from this kind of labor-intensive, cheap labors, right, and there's always this narrative that most of the values, right, in the supply chain, global supply chain, actually goes back to the likes of Apple, Nike, right, who is actually using Chinese cheap labor, but actually keeping most of the benefit and most of the profits.
Sure.
And now actually China wants more share of that cake, right? It wants its own industries to occupy a higher place in the global value ladder. And some people are reading the trade war as an attempt by the Western world to basically keep China forever in that cheap labor position, and it's getting, I think, quite some traction as a narrative now when people are discussing this trade war. But I think there's one very important differentiation here, which is the so-called self-reliance idea, which is this Maoist idea that, like in the past, like when we were talking about pre-Cultural Revolution China, right? So at that time, actually, the Chinese economy was like completely shut from the global economy, right? It's even shut with the Soviet Union after the relationships got bad. And at that time, there's this really like self-dependency idea, right? Because you could not rely on anyone around you. But I think Made in China 2025 is definitely not about self-reliance and self-dependency, even though it's about competitiveness, right?
Sure.
But actually, it will needs the global market to actually make it work, right? If you're looking at China's Belt and Road strategy, for example, a large part of the Belt and Road strategy is about promoting Chinese technologies overseas, right? They want to set railway standards in Africa, right? So that Chinese high-speed railway systems can be exported to another continent, right? So I think the vision of Made in China 2025 is definitely a vision that's embedded within the global market, right? That requires more integration with the global market rather than shutting China up again. So I think in that aspect, I think the nationalists, the right-wing nationalists actually read it wrong, I would say.
Yeah.
And that's why their most high-pitched arguments were actually censored, ironically, by the government and also was criticized by People's Daily and all those official propaganda outlets, because I think the message that the Chinese official positions would like to send is not about shutting China up again, shutting the door again. Actually, they want to embrace the global market. It's only that they want to occupy a higher place in the global value chain.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let's now come to the left wing critique of this. Something that I have not heard reported anywhere else, which you were talking about. Some commentators even thanking Trump for pushing this trade war, arguing that China is not as open as the past leaders of Zhu Rongyi and Deng Xiaoping wanted. And how this is now an opportunity for China to reassess what the parts of its economic system that are not particularly liberalized. Could you talk us through that argument and where that's coming from?
Sure. So there's always this liberal argument saying that actually China should thank the global market and other countries, right, for and also particularly its entrance into the WTO, right, as an opportunity to actually put more pressure domestically to open up the economy and to liberalize the economy, which some still think is insufficient, right? And that argument has existed as I think as long as 2 decades, starting from when China was aspiring, right, to be more integrated into the global market.
Sure.
And I think that kind of sentiment still lingers today, right? So whenever there's any moment in relation to China's WTO commitments, for example, there's always this debate about, okay, did we actually meet our commitment to the WTO for opening up all those sectors? Because people do see that or are frustrated by certain things like very high tax on imported cars, right? I think if you are a Chinese consumer and you are actually aspiring to buy a Cadillac or a Toyota or Lexus, right, and you find that, okay, these cars are much more expensive than a U.S. consumer is paying or a Japanese consumer is paying.
It's almost like 100% more, something like that.
Something like that, yeah. So, yeah, there are people who are actually not happy with the progress China has made in opening up its market, right? So whenever this kind of moments comes, there is always those voices saying, okay, actually, we should open the doors wider anyway, right? So these are opportunities and these are actually beneficial external pressures like Trump's threats or the WTO deadlines and things like that. So this is, I think, a long-lasting or long-standing argument, even that still exists today, that argue that actually China can make use of some of those external pressures to open up its domestic economy wider and also reform its state-owned sector, which is still pretty inefficient. Making use of those pressures. Yeah.
So let's talk about an American who exports cars to China. Actually, he gets a discount because it's they're electronic cars, or electric cars. So Elon Musk also has a role in this story. So talk about how he's involved in the in the social media debate here about the trade war.
Yeah, I think before Trump announced its first round of tariffs, Elon Musk actually tweeted Trump quite openly, complaining about the kind of unfair treatment he got from China, mainly this joint venture arrangements that he is forced into entering. And also the unfair tariffs, right? So in China, if you want to make your cars, right, manufacture your cars here in China, there is still this requirement that you need to form a joint venture with a local partner, and I think you can own probably only 49% of the share and things like that. Most of the other major car makers, they have reached this kind of agreements. I think many of them have set up joint ventures in China. Some of them quite profitable, but Musk complained about it on tweet, and somehow it got caught people's eyes on Chinese social media, and he got pretty heavily ridiculed for his complaint, which shows actually some of the sort of the changing sentiments on Chinese social media when it comes to this kind of economic matters.
So what was the critique of Elon Musk then?
I think people were saying that he was whining because if you look at, for example, how Tesla was subsidized. How Tesla was subsidized heavily in California, for example, right? So it's not like Tesla itself is free from government support and government subsidies, right? Actually, it was pretty heavily subsidized. Back in the U.S.
Yeah, I think
right?
there was a big story around this was post stimulus. He got like a land for really cheap from the state government of California, and then there was a big this was the same like clean energy loan program that was the Solyndra scandal. Whoever remembers that back from 2011, he was definitely a recipient of below market loans that helped him in the early years when Tesla was not Tesla and the rocket company we're not doing too hot.
Yeah, so I think people on social media actually pointed to that and are arguing that he is acting like hypocritically, right? Because to them, China also has a right to actually shield its own nascent EV industry from international competition, because China is also a developing country, and under WTO, actually, China has all the right actually to set up some of those barriers to protect its own nascent car industries, right? So people were basically saying that you are becoming a hypocrite who is actually enjoying U.S. government subsidies, but then complain about Chinese protection of its own car industry.
Sure. So I'm curious if this really does end up heating up the trade war, what different options from a public relations standpoint the government has about how to message any inconveniences that Chinese domestic consumers or domestic companies may face with regards to impacts from the trade war.
Actually, I think it's $1 million question because I think the Chinese government currently is facing quite some difficulties of communicating its trade war positions, right? Because on the one hand, it doesn't want to be seen as making big concessions, right, with the U.S. side. That's why when President Xi Jinping announced a series of market opening measures at Boao Luntan, the Boao Forum, a few weeks ago, the Ministry of Commerce actually has to came out public and say this is not a concession to the U.S. side. Actually, if the U.S. doesn't agree to our demands, right, those market opening measures would not apply to U.S. companies or U.S. businesses, right? So I think they need to play a pretty tricky balancing act here by not showing the public that China is making concessions, but also stick to its long-term vision as sort of a country that actually embraces globalization, right? Because if you look at the messages from the top leadership, China has pretty surprisingly become a sort of a champion of globalization, right? Especially after the election in the United States. So it also doesn't want to abandon that kind of message and suddenly become sort of another economic sort of protectionist economy, right? So I think it has to play the game quite delicately, I would say.
Sure. I'm curious if you could, just like assign a skill level. How good do you think the Chinese government is at communicating these sorts of things and formulating messages that you think can resonate with the broader public? Is this something that's been trending positively or negatively over time? What grade would you give China's the PRC's messaging operation?
Well, so far I would give them a 7, right, out of a 10 or an 8, because I think they're pretty responsive to public sentiments. And so far I think they're managing the messaging quite well, in the sense that first you have plenty of hard talking, right, that makes you seem tough, right, on surface, even if when you look at the substance, China hasn't actually retaliate that strongly. But they have been talking tough. But on the other hand, they have also been offering the kind of measures that actually is consistent with China's globalization messages, right? So internationally, I think it's also better received, I would say, than the Trump administration, right? I think there are even some sympathy from the international side. If you look at, for example, last week, I think the Financial Times comes up with editorial basically saying that the U.S. Negotiation position was like sort of a imperialist kind of treaty offered to China back in the 19th century, right? Yeah. So there's actually some sympathy to China when the U.S. side was acting or being seen as being unreasonable, right? Yeah. So if you look at that, I think the Chinese government is managing its messages quite smartly, I would say.
We spoke this past episode with Chris Balding, a professor at PKU Shenzhen, the HBSC Business School, and he was talking about how disappointed he's been with the Trump messaging, and how, if they were only more focused and drilling home the fact that China's not an open economy, just saying that over and over and over again, and not doing other, trade issues, fighting with allies, picking fights with China and, picking fights with Canada and Mexico
EU.
And the EU of all people,
Yeah.
then maybe we wouldn't be seeing these types of FT columns. But it's interesting how the roles really have reversed, where here we have the U.S. pushing China to open its market, where at the same time Trump just feels like putting up tariff barriers for the sake of tariff barriers.
Yeah.
The role switches back and forth over the past since the beginning of 2017, since the first Xi World Economic Forum speech are really head spinning. So with that, I think I want to turn to a few of my favorite past Chublicopinion columns, and maybe get a little special update. So I'm curious. You wrote earlier about this rise in the domestic movie, particularly this like patriotic movie sentiment, this stream of patriotic movies since the one you focused on was Wolf Warrior 2, John Long R.
Yeah.
But more recently we've seen
Ho
Hai, right? I'm curious if you made it to see that movie and
yes.
and what you thought of it. I think it sold even better than John
not
Long
better,
R, right?
not better, but on the same level probably. Yeah, it's like 3 billion domestic box office.
Sure.
Yeah. I think this is definitely a trend, because I think for years the Chinese propaganda machine has been trying to figure out, right, how to do this kind of nationalistic propaganda more effectively, right? Because in the past it's really hard sell, right? If you ask me when I was a middle school student, right, we have to be forced to a cinema to watch a very boring, like, patriotic movie, and none of them would be successful naturally, right? In the box office, if you give people a choice, nobody would want to see those movies. But I think nowadays, they have found the kind of formula the kind of right formula that actually make patriotic messages more attractive, I would say, to especially a young audience, right? By borrowing a lot of the techniques from Hollywood and packaging it with a Chinese sort of domestic patriotic message. And actually, the Wolf Warrior is sort of a testing case, right, for that kind of formula. And now it seems that people are trying to replicate that with different productions, but essentially the same formula. And Red Sea is another example showing that this is the kind of thing that actually can sell, right, in the Chinese market.
It's funny thinking, actually, even recently there have been a number of U.S. Army sponsored movies. I think there was like something called like Special Forces or something, and it was terrible and it bombed. But the more Hollywoodized Rambos and American Sniper is not necessarily that was supposed to be a raging patriotic movie, but it's interesting how the movie makers who try to sell movies all day and aren't necessarily propagandists, having them be the kind of the base of the soup, and then sprinkling on the nationalism in the end tends to be a more effective formula than having the people who are in charge of messaging all day do this sort of thing.
Yeah. So what actually draws people to the cinemas are actually the actions, right? And all the grenades and all the rocket RPGs and all the weaponry and things like that. But then you sprinkle some patriotic messaging and it sort of worked.
Yeah, because a past trend in these movies, and one that I confess I fell asleep 45 minutes into because it was so awful, is hiring really famous actors and singers. I think I watched like the founding of the founding of the army or founding of the republic, right? And there are all these Xiao Xianrou, there are all these 20 somethings who look like they're 17, and they're playing army, famous people from the
Communist Party
history, but they're not very committed to their roles because their agents force them to do this, and it just doesn't really gel.
So I would say it's a process of trying to find the right formula that actually draws the audience to the cinema. Yeah.
So Amazing China, which is the big new
it's a documentary.
Sort
of a documentary.
Tried to was going over the same was trying to hit more things than just what Wolf Warrior 2. I'm curious if you saw that and had any thoughts.
I haven't seen Amazing China, but I've seen The Pillars of a Great Power, 大国重器, which is all about manufacturing, actually. Also a CCTV production. And I would argue that, there's a new genre of sort of nationalist or patriotic propaganda that's focusing on engineering, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because engineering is naturally less threatening to the outside world than if you are flexing your military muscles, right? So if you are American or sort of an African viewer and you watch Wolf Warrior, you probably would be sort of put off by
it did get a global release, actually, though. I made my parents go watch it back in the US, and I think they got a big kick out of it, just because we're not used to seeing Americans be the bad guys in movies,
or the weaker guys.
They had this great line. They're just like, "Where are your Marines now?"
So I can compare to that. Those kind of engineering documentaries are less threatening. I would say the message is less jarring, I would say.
Sure.
Because it's all about building stuff.
More boring, though.
Yeah.
Definitely more boring.
Yeah, it's about building cranes and building like those heavy machineries.
Big bridges and tunnels.
Yeah. But in terms of, I would say propaganda and publicity, it also worked quite well because it draws, especially I think if you are young people, it also make you more interested in engineering. Which is also quite important, right, for the country if you're attracting people into the industries, right? But actually, an interesting twist is that after this trade war dispute, those kind of, especially I think Amazing China, got
it had a big ZTE feature in it. The movie,
so it has to be pulled from cinemas, right? Because at some point, I think the people in charge of publicity and propaganda felt that China is being too out there, right, with this kind of message. When they realized
a little more.
Because in those documentary, it depicts China as already very like strong and very successful as sort of a manufacturing sort of powerhouse, right? But then this CTE thing happened, which makes China, I think, realize how vulnerable it still is, right? And when the U.S. decides to pull the plug, basically, on one of the largest Chinese companies, and the company was just helpless, right? Because I think 90% or even 95% of its chips are sort of reliant on U.S. suppliers, right? So whenever the U.S. cut that and pulled the plug on that, the whole company sort of came to a halt, right? Because their production could not continue. So it shows how vulnerable the Chinese industries are still, right, at this moment, despite all the sort of propaganda that we're already a very strong like manufacturing powerhouse and our engineering prowess is sort of world level and things like that.
Yeah.
So I think it makes people, at least some people, realize that China still has a long way to go in its industrial rejuvenation, right? And you shouldn't be too sort of complacent about where you have achieved, basically.
Well, on that ambiguous note, I think we'll call it an episode. This was fantastic. Thanks so much for coming. And the next time you write another econ-focused column, we'll be sure to have you back on.
Oh, thank you.
给谁听？听不清吗？你看不见吗？你的大脑呢？大家醉了，我还醒着，说不出什么感觉，当我准备去告别，我心中荒草家园，真理出没的夜，新的人间有化妆舞会早已经开演，好了再见，我要走了，大家一起去消遣，就让感简单的简单。Oh Marcelo， 大家一起来干杯，为这个快乐的年代。Oh Marcelo， 你滚你赶你滚蛋，你追我赶的2000年。Oh Marcelo， 有多美，我说不出什么感觉，当我准备去告别，我心中荒草家园，真理出没的夜，新的人间化妆舞会早已经开演，好了再见，我要走了。Yeah, let's get drunk. Oh Marcelo， Oh my salo Oh my salo下了游戏，下了面具，下了规矩，学习蓝天白云，星光透明，还有真理。多疑，别当真，别多问，别乱猜。我没有答案，悲伤是吗？荒唐是吧？你哪有办法？终究咱们都小康吧。大家一起去修身，就让它简单的简单。Oh my salo， 大家一起来干杯，为这个快乐的年代。Oh my salo， 你滚你玩你滚蛋，你追我赶的2000年。Oh my salo， 大家再来干一杯，为这个娱乐的年代。Oh my salo， 啦啦啦啦啦啦啦，快乐的简单。Oh my salo， 啦啦啦啦啦啦啦，我这个操蛋的年代。Oh my salo， 啦啦啦啦啦啦啦，追我赶的2000年。Oh my salo。